Thank you. So welcome back. Our last session today provides an overview of energy system-wide modeling approaches and challenges, and looks at how these models can inform long-term energy planning to derive insights such as targets, policies, and investment strategies. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Todd Levin, who is a technical contributor to Net Zero World and leads the electricity markets team at Argonne National Laboratory. Over the past decade, Dr. Levin has developed advanced methodologies for modeling of complex interactions in electricity markets, and he has had extensive engagements in international energy development, including a range of global energy security issues addressed through his work with USAID, the Ministry of Energy at Ghana, and the US Department of Energy. So thank you for being here, Todd. Please remember to unmute yourself and share your screen to start your presentation.
Excellent, thanks, Clarice. Can you see the screen all right?
Yes, yes, we can.
Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. And I think this is will hopefully be an interesting talk. I think following Brent's talk, I think it will be, that set the stage nicely for what I want to talk about. So I'm planning to talk about the role of system-wide energy models in the decarbonization challenge. And I think what Brent just shared was an excellent application of models to develop some pathways. But the challenge is bigger than just executing models. There's also implementation challenges, and a whole suite of different models and analyses are required to meet the challenge. So I'm going to get into what we can learn from models and maybe what we can't learn from models, or where we need to supplement with additional activities. Just a brief overview of what I'm going to discuss, but I'd like to just start by introducing this concept of whole energy system models and what we mean when we talk about them. I come largely from a power sector background, and there's a whole host of different models that can be applied just to look at issues in the power sector. But of course, that's only a small piece of the decarbonization challenge. And part of that challenge is addressing emissions that emerge in other sectors. But of course, these sectors are linked. We've discussed, as Brent mentioned, the transport sector transitioning to electric vehicles is great for reducing immediate emissions from the transportation sector, but it depends on the emissions intensity of your power sector, of course, and so on. So typically, when we talk about the whole system energy models, we're looking at the intersection of all of these different sectors. And each one of these, more or less, each one of these different circles on the right here can have its own model. And so you can start with a high-level perspective of the whole energy system, and then drill down and apply different models that focus on one sector. And even within sectors, there's different scales of models. But when we're talking about a global decarbonization challenge, what we need are long horizon planning models, 15 to 50 years roughly, to inform long-term policy decisions and strategies, more so than individual investments. So models like these are generally not going to tell you whether or not to build a specific wind turbine in a specific location, or help you choose between two very specific sites, but it may broadly inform policies at the country level or at the regional level, or identify regions within a country where you might want to prioritize wind development, for example. But again, these models are generally the first step to help identify a broad pathway that can inform decision making, and then can be supplemented with more detailed models. So I'd also just like to kind of clarify some common language. We often refer to models, but I think often what we mean when people say models as shorthand are really modeling frameworks. So when you talk about large tools, and we'll hear more about these tomorrow, such as TIMES and LEAP and GCAM message and others, really those are modeling frameworks, and they can be built around specific applications, customized for different type of analyses. But the specific models are defined by the data and the assumptions that you use within that framework, and how you represent your system, your objectives, and so on. And so sometimes it just helps to be a little bit more precise in your language when talking about a specific model, or a piece of software or modeling framework that can be applied in different ways. So the decarbonization challenge. I'm starting kind of leading off with a understatement here, but it's already been discussed, but decarbonizing the global economy will be hard. It's not a simple question or a simple challenge. If it were, we wouldn't need all of these models and tools to help us figure out the best pathways. And there are countless potential pathways. Some may be preferred over others, but I don't think you will ever say that there is one, at a global level, one truly optimal pathway. Have different objectives, different stakeholders, different countries. And I think it's also important to remember that conditions will change as we proceed along these pathways. So, your identified optimal pathway today may look very different than the one 5 years from now, based on new information, new technologies, new costs, and new constraints that emerge. And so it's important to always be revisiting your pathway. It's not immutable or locked in. But having that reference pathway, like the one Brett presented, can still be for driving decision making as you move forward. And again, I think maybe one thing to stress here too is that many of today's models or modeling frameworks weren't necessarily designed for the decarbonization challenge. That doesn't mean that they can't be used, and they still are very useful for this challenge. And they are constantly evolving to address the challenge. But a lot of the traditional tools we have in place that maybe were developed in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s were designed for more traditional power systems or energy systems built around fossil fuels and others. And there are some unique aspects of decarbonized energy systems that maybe these tools weren't designed to address. So it's important to remember that and understand as develop models at the country or global level. So modeling is a process too. I think sometimes I use the term more than a model. So it's not just about having a model. It's about this whole modeling process, modeling infrastructure or ecosystem, where you collect data. So models fundamentally are a way of interpreting data. And you're not going to learn anything from a model that isn't captured within your data to some extent, and within the assumptions and the logic that you feed into that model. So it's kind of, I think of this as a circular process. You collect data, develop scenarios for analysis, apply your models, interpret the results is a very important step that sometimes gets overlooked. Sometimes there's a tendency to apply a model and then just copy and paste the results and say, here's the results, and not really go through the critical step of understanding what the implications are, or what human actions can be taken or should be taken based on those results. So that's make decisions, and then you start over, or you continue this cycle. It's not a one-time analysis. Sometimes this is done on a yearly cycle, sometimes maybe a 5-yearly cycle, or even irregularly, just as needed. But you should always be revisiting your data, your assumptions, your model, and updating as you progress through pathways that you develop. Another important thing to identify are just the incredibly wide range of decision horizons that come up in the energy system. This timeline is a rough timeline. It's largely built around the power system, but just to give you some sense of the different decisions and the timescales that are at play in a power system, you have stability issues that are already all the way down to the second or sub-second that require advanced controls, and then you have planning. Whole system planning, like we're talking about today, or transmission planning, or some resource investments that take years or decades of lead time, and then everything in between. And the key is that one modeling framework is likely not going to help inform decisions across all of these, this whole time horizon. And so when you design a model and design your applications, you need to think about what questions are you trying to answer, what kind of decisions are you trying to inform. One model cannot generally do it all. So key considerations: models are not applied to find the answer. And I think I mentioned something like this a few minutes ago, but they should be a source or a tool that can be used to inform decision making. It's short-sighted to just run a model and say, this is the answer, this is the best pathway, let's go ahead, let's implement it, and then we're done. That's not really the way it works, because there are implementation challenges that aren't always captured in models. There's lots of local issues or financing issues, or I could go on, that aren't captured in models. And so it provides you a starting point, but you need to be adaptable in real life for implementation. Best practice is often to apply multiple models in parallel. So that could be with multiple different sector models, or it could be with multiple whole energy system models. They may give you different results, different models. That's okay. That's even useful, because you can start to understand what are the differences between these models and why do they lead to different results. What's the advantage of one pathway over another that different models identified, and provide some human input into that decision making. And then, as I mentioned before, model linkages, both for different sectors and different levels of geographic and temporal resolution, can be very helpful for narrowing in on a problem. I like this quote. This is from a paper that reviewed a number of model frameworks. But there's no energy tool that addresses all the issues. This was specifically related to integrating renewable energy, but applies more broadly. But instead, the ideal tool is highly dependent on the specific objectives that must be fulfilled. So you really need to customize your analysis for the questions that you're trying to answer. So what are modeling objectives, and what can models tell you? I split this into three categories. It's a rough split and maybe constantly in flux. But what can these models tell you? What maybe they can't tell you yet, but people are working on, and what generally models will not tell you. So they will tell you, give you a resource portfolio, for example. It may be a modeled least cost resource portfolio, but it's up to you, the decision maker, decide, is that really the optimal portfolio for my country, for my region, based on factors on the ground. It can give you cost projections, emissions projections, and help you identify priority actions, or understand broad policy or costs, say parameter costs or demand sensitivities, and understand how changes in those parameters might impact the least cost portfolio. Are not always able to address, I'm caveating this because some do and some do better than others, but impact of human behavior. So technology adoption and human decision making about energy use and response to price signals and things like that. Demand response, for example, price response of demand is often captured in modeling, but it may not capture true human behavior at the individual level. Socioeconomic considerations around equity and energy justice, which is a growing consideration that models are trying to catch up with, and also how to grow your economy while decarbonizing. Again, that's something that can be evaluated and modeled, but a lot of times energy models don't directly consider those effects as well. And then I think kind of at their core, what models can't tell you what will happen. Models are not trying to predict the future. They are telling you, giving you a guideline for what pathways to pursue based on your current understanding of the future. But we can never predict the future. Things will change and we need to be adaptable. Models generally don't tell you how to implement identified investments, where exactly to put that wind turbine, or which banks to use for financing, or all of these countless decision level or implementation level decisions that have to be made. Either require a whole kind of tiered modeling approach, or intervention by human decision makers. Okay, so I like, this was a pretty recent, just a week or two ago, came out an opinion essay in the New York Times that caught my eye, and I like the message here. It's a little bit of a provocative title, but the idea, it gets at this idea of using models to drive decision making, to drive action. And the argument in this, you can find it on the New York Times website, is that we don't know exactly what a net zero emissions energy system will look like 10, 20, 30 years from now. We can run models and we can get projections based on prices, and those are valuable. They paint pathways. But the key is, what should we be doing today? We need to be doing something today. And this article argues, we know enough to drive action for the next decade, essentially. We need new renewables, electric vehicles, storage. We need to reduce energy intensity. And there are lots of things that we can start doing now, even if there's some uncertainty about what the future will look like. So I think the key message here is, don't let this future uncertainty kind of paralyze you until you feel like you know what's going to happen in the future. There's plenty of actions we can take today that will not be wasted, even if things evolve a little bit. more into model specifics. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some different types of categories of models or modeling frameworks that differ, and there are different ways of evaluating and addressing some of these challenges, and just highlighting that these are not mutually exclusive. So a single modeling framework can have multiple of these attributes. But some models use more of a simulation approach where they simulate interactions between different sectors or of different actors or consumers. There's general or partial equilibrium models that match supply and demand. Partial equilibrium consider full macroeconomic feedbacks. Optimization models are generally applied to find a global least cost solution, but there could be other objective functions as well. Top down or bottom up, kind of depending on if you take a high level view of the whole economy or a bottom up view of individual technologies and trying to understand how adopted. And then there's this kind of distinction between investment models and operational models, certainly with overlap. Some models look at both, but some models may not consider investment decisions and might give you information on how to work with the system that you currently have, but may not drive long-term investments. I think generally for the type of modeling we're talking about here, most of them will long-term decarbonization challenge. And this was adopted. I've referred to both of these references. There are links at the end. Journal paper and this IRENA report from 2017 that are both great resources. Okay, so some sample modeling frameworks. Here's 4 different modeling tools or frameworks you're going to hear more about tomorrow. So I'm not an expert on any one of these models in particular, but tomorrow there will be people who are, who will talk in much more detail about what they can do and how they've been applied. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time because you'll hear more about this tomorrow. But just to show that there's different types of models, they use different solution concepts, different formulations for generating solutions and modeling technology choice, and a range of different sample applications and existing net zero analyses. Again, no one of these models is inherently superior to the other in every way, and your choice may depend on a lot of considerations, and ideally you would probably use more than one model, more than one of these models, or more than one modeling framework to analyze the challenges you're facing at the country level. Just highlighting again this IRENA report and another paper that are very comprehensive model comparison surveys. So I'm not getting into that level of detail, but I think this paper compared something like 75 different energy system models, and there's a lot of good information in there. And same with the IRENA. IRENA report talks about a lot of considerations for modeling renewable transitions. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through some of these. I'm noticing I've got about 5 minutes left, but I did want to touch on some challenges and considerations around model development. So the first being data.
Todd, we can run over a little bit.
A little bit, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I won't rush it too much, but yeah.
Yeah.
But I think so. Data is kind of the most fundamental consideration for a model. Like I said earlier, your model will not tell you anything that isn't already in the data. Really, a model is a engine or an analytic engine for analyzing data and making projections based on data that you as the user feed into the model and assumptions that you make. Data collection, I pulled this number a little bit arbitrarily, but I think it's about right, that a lot of times the data side of model development will take something like 80% of your time, whether it's collecting or formatting or organizing, understanding, filling in gaps. There will always be missing data where you might have to make assumptions. There will always be imprecise data where it doesn't quite fit the needs of your model. And because of this, good models are not a replacement for good data. I think that's really important. Models are a tool for making sense of the data, but they do not replace human analysis and decision. Specifically for decarbonization challenges, there's going to be new data sources that have been traditionally less important, that are much more important in models that look at decarbonization. Some of these things here. There was a comment about critical materials earlier. I think that's an important one. actually have the materials we need to build and implement all these technologies, resource profiles, supply curves, costs, things like that. Okay. Assumptions shape the value of a model for a target application. So there's always inherent uncertainty about the future. We can't predict the future with certainty. Two examples: we can't predict technology costs. Go back 20 years and try to predict the cost of a lithium-ion battery. You could make a good guess, and some people may have gotten it right, but today, you know, it would have been very challenging to pin that down with any great accuracy. Same with demand for services. There might be new technologies developed in the next 10 years that we're not even thinking about today. So it's important to understand which assumptions drive your results, and sometimes which assumptions define your results. So sometimes you'll be implementing a model and you'll see, this is a simple example, but say from the power sector, you'll see all of your new technology investment is in, say, wind capacity. Well, rather than just taking that at face value, maybe it's useful to change your technology cost, the wind cost, and see if there's a tipping point where if wind gets more expensive, all of a sudden everything shifts over to solar or back to natural gas or whatever it might be, and not just say, you know, here are my assumptions, and therefore our country is going to pursue a 100% wind strategy. You want to understand which assumptions are driving those results. So in the context of decarbonization, some additional assumptions. How are emissions defined and counted? Are you looking at full life cycle emissions, or only you know, only the carbon dioxide coming out of your power plants and your vehicle? Are you going to consider net negative emissions technologies like, you know, carbon capture, for example? How are you modeling the decarbonization trajectory? Is this a 2035, 2050 target, 100% decarbonized in that year, but no strict targets until then? Or are you going to implement more of a gradual approach? And then, you know, technology costs also. System representation. So models only approximate reality. You're not going to model millions of individual consumers, millions of individual buildings, right? You're always creating some sort of aggregation or some approximation, whether it's geographic or temporal resolution. Long-term planning models might, you know, maybe every year have like an annual time step. Sometimes you might look only every 5 years. You're often considering generic technology types, not necessarily, again, for a country level or a global whole energy system model, not necessarily modeling the specifics of, you know, a very customized natural gas plant or, you know, I don't know, resource extraction facility or something like that. You're likely creating an aggregated picture of your transmission and distribution system, or your resource supply chains, or whatever else it might be. Even in the best case, models generally capture the real world imperfectly. Societal objectives, human preferences, and behavioral change, like I talked about before. And then, you know, highly localized issues. Maybe you can capture land use broadly and say, you know, we have land available for agriculture in this region of the country, or, you know, good wind profile. But when you get down to the truly local level, where to site turbines, the example I gave before, you might not cite into that from a big picture. Specifically, more specifically for decarbonization, how do you model this net zero goal? Is it a hard constraint in your formulation? You know, you could have an optimization problem and say you have to hit this constraint, and the computer will chug away and give you the result. But it might not show you that, you know, 20% of that cost comes from hitting that last 1% of decarbonization, and that's useful information to know. Or do you model it as a soft constraint and allow your solver to relax the target or do you model it rather than through a constraint, provide economic incentives and drive your system towards decarbonization that way? Longer planning horizons are needed, and I think implementation challenges are going to be more pronounced in these. And the last one I think is important as well, ensuring reliability of supply. New metrics are needed for reliability. From the power system, we're still grappling with how to assess reliability, for example, in a 100% renewable system. Supply chains, critical materials, getting materials and resources where they need to go. These challenges in a decarbonized system we're talking about different types of materials and resources than we were. Okay, finally, interpreting results. So I've keep driving this home, but models don't make decisions, people do. Results must be interpreted in the context of all of these other factors I've just been talking about: data, assumptions, scenarios, your system representation. And we need to overcome the tendency of policymakers to interpret results as the answer. So what I mean by that, when, as modelers or as engineers or analysts, you this modeling exercise, publish your report, there's this tendency for a policymaker to pick up the report, look at your one figure at the top and say, great, here, this is a picture of our system in 2030, and be done with it. And that's not the way to interpret results, right? And I think a lot of us are aware of that on some level, but communication is just as important as a good, rigorous modeling exercise. You can't assume that people, policymakers, will read your 300-page report and pick up on all the caveats. You have to figure out a way to communicate the full context of your models and your modeling results in a way that's understandable and actually help people make decisions. So additive challenges for decarbonization, results will be well outside of the current status quo. So it may be hard to even picture or wrap your head around what this means. Large numbers. Gunther mentioned, we went from millions to billions to trillions. It's sometimes it's just hard to grasp the what it actually means to fully electrify a vehicle portfolio in a country in the next 10, 15 years, everything that goes into that. So it may look good on paper, and people, and policymakers may say, let's go for it, but they may not understand the full implications of policies they implement to get there. Emphasize pathways versus just focusing on the end goal. I think this is important as well. And I liked, again, Brent's presentation earlier does a nice job of that, of showing pathway. We may stray from that pathway a little bit, and we will reevaluate along the way. But it's not just about this is the ultimate, the 2050. This is what our system will look like in 2050. It's here's some ways to get there. Here's how the evolution will look, and let's constantly revisit along the way. So general best practices. This is just a sort of a summary of what I've been talking about, but a lot of parameter uncertainties in any kind of modeling analysis related to decarbonization. The pathways are important, and additional tools and experience beyond the models are needed to interpret results, clearly communicate actionable outcomes, and actually make decisions and set policy. I think that's it. Yeah, so here are the references I referenced. You can find 3 of these are journal papers, and then the one IRENA report is also a really good reference for learning more about these types of models. And that's it. I'll gladly take any questions. I know I'm a couple minutes over, but happy to take some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Todd. A great overview of the approaches and challenges associated with energy system-wide modeling. And it really sets the stage for tomorrow's talks as well, where we will take deeper dives into some of the modeling tools. I have a few questions. I also see there's some in the chat, so maybe I'll just stick with one here. So in terms of uncertainties, you had mentioned that it's important to understand the assumptions that define the results. But my question is, can you also discuss some ways in which scenarios could be better developed to account for changing conditions, particularly if they are disruptive changes?
Right. That's a really good question. I didn't get into scenario development as much. And so I think maybe this is more of a personal preference, but I really like using fairly extreme scenarios, I think is maybe one way to look at it, to really understand what I call the tipping points in your model, and what changes in parameters might lead to a totally different pathway, rather than just a marginally different pathway. So for example, if you have a scenario with say a baseline demand scenario for a product, and then you have one that with demand that's 2 or 5% higher, you will likely see a little bit more of everything that you needed in your baseline scenario. You might see, you need more electricity, you need more fuel, etc. If you do an extreme demand sensitivity, or say an extreme cost sensitivity, and even if you don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but it will help you understand what drives changes in the decisions you need to make. And I think one thing that we can all remember is that even if you think something won't happen, that doesn't mean it won't happen. So your reference scenario doesn't have to be, you know, what you think will transpire or is most likely to transpire. It's a reference for analyzing other sensitivities. So anyway, yeah, I hope that kind of addresses the question a little bit.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah. I want to go to a question from Indonesia, and there was a similar one from Net Zero World as well. So the combined question is really around if you can address the gap in terms of energy system-wide models not being able to fully address socioeconomic considerations, and then you know, so how to, and also how to communicate that with policymakers. So more broadly, I think the second part of that question is addressing, you know, going from scenario development to application in strategic decision making. So
one piece of that is this is becoming a more relevant issue that people are more aware of, and so I do think that models are trying to catch up and figure out ways to incorporate socioeconomic impacts or equity, for example. But you know, there's always going to be some lag in catching up, and also just some inherent challenges that models won't be able to capture. So in terms of communicating, I think it's important to communicate to policymakers again that your model is a guide, that policymakers can choose to override elements of that modeled outcome based on, you know, on the ground experience. So if you have a modeling result that shows here's the generation mix you need to serve demand in your country, talking from the power sector, but you know, someone with more on the ground experience might recognize that this leaves a certain region of your country underserved, or you know, won't provide the resources they need, then maybe it's okay to step in and say, you know, this is a good starting point, but let's add some human decision making. Maybe it'll cost a little bit more, but it's important. It's an important objective for our country that wasn't captured in the mathematical objective function to make sure that this population is well served. But that gets challenging, right? Anytime you're telling policymakers that you have model results, but that they shouldn't, you know, listen to them exclusively, then there's a little bit of give and take. So I don't know if I have the perfect answer, but just that it should be more of an open communication and back and forth. Policymakers can come back and with questions and say, can you look at this in more detail? Or what if we did this instead? How would that change supply and costs and things like that? So maybe I'll summarize that by going back to that circle I had, where it's sort of a process and not just like hand off the results and expect, you know.
Yes.
Anyway,
That's
yeah.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Todd. I'll take one more question from Argentina. So you've clearly stated that the decisions in the electricity sector are nested within some timeframes, and a long-term scenario isn't necessarily viable in the short-term operation. So what are the minimum tests that one should use to see the viability of specific long-term scenarios?
Yeah, so the way I'm interpreting this is sort of a distinction between long-term investment models and short-term operational or implementation models. So again, I'm going to fall back on my experience from the power sector, but this is a challenge that comes up a lot, where you might have an investment model that is necessarily kind of coarse and aggregated, and will give you a generation portfolio, but the model may not fully capture the reliability impacts in your system. It might not have a perfect transmission system representation, or, you know, hourly or sub-hourly dispatch, for example. So in that case, I think the best approach is some kind of an iterative approach. So you can run this aggregate model, look at big picture issues, feed those results into a more detailed, you know, production cost model or system stability type model, again, speaking for the power system here, and simulate that system and try to identify, are there any impacts that came up that we couldn't identify in our higher level model? If there are, then you feed that back into the higher level model and maybe add some constraints and say, we need more firm resources, even if it wasn't identified in the original least cost scenario. And put that in as a constraint. It might raise, the perceived cost of your system in the first model, but as a human decision maker, that it actually lead to a better outcome in the long run. So again, in summary, it's kind of an iterative process, and you have to sit in the middle of all that and manage the interactions between your different models.
Thank you so much, Todd. More comments coming in that it was a very clear and useful presentation. So thank you. If there are additional questions for any of the speakers, the contact information for participants will be made available after the event. So, so that concludes day 2, and I will turn it over to Gunter for closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Clarice, and thank you to all of our speakers today, Todd and Brent, and all the country presenters from Argentina, Chile, and Egypt. I think I'm really excited about what we've heard today. We've seen examples from countries around the world. We've had a really illuminating presentation from Brent to set the global stage, and I think really Todd's presentation was really right on target to set the stage for tomorrow. Because just like he said, we always try to believe that our models tell us the future, and that's really not the case. It's driven by assumptions and inputs into the model, data that was driven home by Brent, that was driven home by Todd, and so I think so this was an exciting day. I think very, very valuable insights from all of our speakers. And I think there's a whole lot more to come tomorrow. So we have four modeling groups presenting their tools tomorrow. I think all of the 2 presentations from Brent and Todd really set the stage for that. So you should keep those points that they made today in mind when you hear about the different models tomorrow. And you've already seen it in some of the country presentations yesterday as well as today. Most folks, groups that around the world, they don't use just one model, right? So we've seen some charts where people show their modeling framework, and often it is more than just one model. You've seen one, I think it was perhaps it was in Chile, I forget, message and leap, or maybe it was Argentina, I forget if it was Gustavo or Cherson who presented that, but. So the message is one model often doesn't do the job. You have to sort of put together a framework that relies on multiple models. Just like the point that the answer to the last question, we have investment tools, and then we have operational tools, and we have more detailed stability tools and things. So it's a collection of models that we need to employ to make sure the pathways that we develop to our endpoint are reliable, secure, and affordable. And so with this, I'd like to close out our day 2. I'm super excited about what I heard today, and I'm super excited about what we're going to hear tomorrow. So hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I hope to see you soon again tomorrow morning, same time. For tomorrow, I think what we'll do is we'll just send you another email with the meeting link so that you don't have to weed through your inbox, which I had to do this morning to find the meeting link. So we'll send everyone the meeting link for tomorrow, just about 15 minutes before start. So happy to have you join today, and I'm excited to see you again tomorrow. So thank you very much. Goodbye.